Welcome to the 5 Acre Woods. Today we're going to be discussing how to build a worm farm, otherwise known as vermiculture. You might ask why someone might want to raise worms. Well, it's because worms produce a very natural worm castings, which is great for your garden. It enhances your soil and you have no fear of overfeeding, underfeeding, or burning your plants. So let's get started right away. Here's a list of things that you're going to need to build your farm. First of all, you're going to need 3 bins. These bins are 10-gallon bins. This is a perfect size for me because they're easy to pick up. Worm castings can become very dense and heavy, so think about that when you're choosing your bins. You're going to need 3 identical bins and 1 lid. You're going to need a drill. You're going to need a 1/8 drill bit and a 5/16 drill bit. I'll explain why we chose to use 2 different sizes as we go along. I have 3 glass jars here. They're kind of squatty. They're very sturdy. I use them to elevate my 1 bin. You can use a brick. You can use terracotta pots. Use something sturdy. We started out with plastic flower pots. And when the worm castings got heavy, they began to crush the flower pots. So we've changed over to glass jars. A little water, some cardboard, either torn up from boxes, paper towel holders, toilet paper rolls. The worms seem to like the cardboard. And then I have some food here that I'll explain when it's time to feed. You're going to need some shredded paper, which I have over here, and a little bit of potting soil or peat moss. Your choice. We have potting soil around all the time, so that's what we chose to use. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to do to get started is your first bin here is going to remain exactly the way it is, no holes. You're going to place the glass jars or whatever you choose to elevate your next bin in the corners or the sides. This is to keep 1 bin from sitting on the bottom of this bin because any liquid that's produced by the worms or the food that you put in the bin will drip through and collect at the bottom, and you don't want it flooding your next bin and drowning your worms. Okay. The next 2 bins that you're going to take, you're going to take the 5/16 inch drill bit and you're going to drill about 20 holes in the bottom. We also drilled 3 holes on each side of the bin. These are for air circulation and so that the worms can go through the holes when they need to. And we'll explain that as we go along also. We're not going to drill the holes because you already know how to do that. So, and there's no exact magic number. Just make sure that you drill some holes for the air circulation and so the worms can travel through. That's why we used the bigger drill bit for those holes. In the lid, we have drawn a grid pattern and we've also drilled holes in the lid. We used the smaller drill bit for the lid. That way the worms can't get out of the lid. We have heard that sometimes they try to do that. We have not had any experience with that whatsoever, but we do have smaller holes. You also want air circulation in your lid. You'll also notice that we drew a grid pattern on the lid numbered 1 through 6, and we'll explain that when we explain the feeding. Okay. So the next thing you're going to do is to begin adding some of the elements that are going to make up your worm farm. So we take the paper towel holders or whatever kind of cardboard you have and you lay them in the bottom. I already have some moistened paper towel holders and things here, and I'm just going to put them right in the bottom and spread them around. And then we have shredded paper and about 2 cups of potting soil, all mixed up in this bag. You can mix it in the bin if you want. I like to moisten mine beforehand. It just makes it a little easier, and I can make sure that it really is moist. And so this is what it will look like when you get done putting everything in. Some of that brown paper came from packaging that we got through some mail order items. It was perfect, nice and clean. Okay, then you're gonna, if you haven't pre-moistened, you're just gonna add some water into your bin, mix it all up so that the paper is moist but not dripping wet. Your worms like a moist environment, and they will reproduce very quickly in a warm and moist environment. Okay, so next we're going to talk about how to stack your worm bins. So you'll see that this bin is right on top of this one, and then for the first time your lid goes on top. When you're ready and you have ordered your worms and they've come, what you're going to do next is just take the area where grid 1 is, make a little well in the paper, put your food in, and cover it back up. So now let's talk about the food. I have some things cut up in here. You can see it's kind of small. This is just some pieces of lettuce. I cut it up in what I call bite-sized chunks. You're going to see through other videos that some people blend their food. Other people put it in whole. I want my worms to do an efficient job as quickly as possible. I also don't want to spend all this time blending my food into smoothies for my worms. So I cut it up into small chunks, and I use this container to keep them for the week. Every time that I have kitchen scraps, I throw them in here. When this gets about half full, that's probably enough for a week's feeding. I stick it in the freezer. The night before I feed, I take it out. It thaws, I dump it in, and that's the end of it. I feed my worms once a week. We feed our worms every Wednesday because that's the day we started our worm farm. And then we check them again on Saturday just to make sure they still have enough food to last through the week. Sometimes your worms can really eat quickly. You'll be amazed at how much food and food scraps they go through in a short period of time and turn it into worm castings. How will you know your worms are hungry? Since they make no noise, they'll begin to climb up the sides of your bin. And when you take the lid off, you'll see that there'll be several worms climbing up looking for food. If you find that that's a problem, just add a little more food at the beginning of the week when you feed. Make sure that you feed a little more. I can take the lid off of here and just show you that we have probably some banana peels, some strawberries, some tomatoes, some melon, just about anything that you cut up in your kitchen for salads, raw vegetables, things like that. They can also have leaves, grass clippings, flowers, as long as the flowers have not been put into a chemical that keeps them fresher longer. There's a few things that your worms cannot have. No meats, no dairy, no onions, no citrus, no garlic. There are several videos that will tell you a couple of these things won't really matter. We've just recommended that you don't use them at all. Why cause a problem? So we don't feed our worms any of those things. Our worms have, this system has worked extremely well for our worms. We are done our first bin, and this is actually my second bin that I'm getting ready to add. So this bin will actually be going on top of another bin that has already been in use for 6 weeks. Our worms have gone completely through the grid pattern on the lid, and we are ready now for them to come up through the bottom to look for food in this bin and begin feeding up here. Then in a few weeks, we'll harvest the castings that are in our first bin, which we're going to take a look at now so you can tell what it will look like after you begin feeding your worms and they have time to start really going through and turning your kitchen scraps into valuable worm castings. Okay. Here's what our worm bin looks like after 6 weeks. Okay, we started feeding in grid 1. We moved all the way around. We now have fed into grid 6 on Wednesday. Today is Saturday, so they've had a few days to go through some of the food. You can see some moistened paper here that is not broken down. I added this paper about 2 weeks ago because most of the paper I added on day 1 was completely gone. So we added some more so they would have some bedding. I'm going to pull this back a little bit to see if you can see any worms or food. I'm not sure whether you will. Worms do not like light. They will avoid it at all costs. And so as soon as you take the lid off, they tend to dive deep so they can avoid any light. So we're going to cover that back up and put a lid back on so they can not get too stressed about that. Okay, now the last thing that we want to talk about is where to keep your worms after you have everything ready. You have a choice whether to keep them inside or out. We have chosen to keep our worms inside for several reasons. One, it's easier for me to remember to feed my worms every week if they're right there. 2, it keeps them safe from predators or infestations from insects. And 3, it's warmer. I don't have to worry about the weather or anything disturbing my worms. And so we keep our worms in our kitchen. It's really not a big deal. It doesn't smell. If your worm bin smells, then you're putting something in there that you shouldn't. Get back to us, comment about what you're feeding your worms, and maybe we can help you figure it out. But there should be no smell coming from here other than maybe an earthy smell like dirt. When we put our worms, we will be moving our worms down into our basement, which is climate controlled anyway. So when we intend to start a few more worm bins. So when that happens and we can't keep them in the kitchen any longer, we will move them downstairs. But honestly, it hasn't caused any problems whatsoever keeping them in the kitchen. For those that keep their worms outside, you do have a few more things that you need to consider. One is that you can have predators get into your worms like raccoons. I'm not really sure what other animals, maybe possums, things like that, might try to get in there and eat your worms. So you're going to have to be careful of that. The other thing is infestations from insects. I guess there can be flies, ants, things like that that are attracted to the food that you're putting in there, and they can get in there. They can lay eggs. They can, they're not going to, I don't think, hurt your worms, but you really don't want that mixed in with your worms. So if you decide to leave them outside, you're going to have to check them a little more often to make sure that those things haven't happened. And if they have happened, there are several videos on YouTube that explain what to do if you run into those problems. We really appreciate you watching our video. We hope it's been helpful. If you have any questions or comments, please comment. And we hope to see you soon on our next video, which is going to be on harvesting the worm castings. So we hope to see you soon back here at the 5 Acre Woods. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.